I've been here for as long as I remember, running through the plains of civilized Ethiopia. Way back then we used to call it Abyssinia, played by the Nile River, me and my brothers. I came via vessel called my mother. We spoke mentally, then she conceived me immaculately. My father is Osiris and we took trips to Sirius. Stopped on Mars where we built a few pyramids. Came back home, I knew it wouldn't be long before the invasion began, so we wrote it in stone. Me and Mello took a quick trip to Asia, scoped the place out before they called it minor major. Built a few temples to praise we, the Buddha. The people called us Nagas, symbolic of the dragon. I've been to places you can't even imagine. Put the Jupe in Jupiter, put the rings around Saturn. Carved out the rocks for that Stonehenge pattern. We played with the stars before we started playing Madden. Do you remember? Can you recall? Cause if you think you were a slave, you can't remember at all. I said, Joe, do you remember? Can you recall? Cause if you think you were a slave, you can't remember at all, son. It's all for the love, so I love what I does. ALD, think of me till your heart hears a buzz. Here's a buzz.
On occasions like this, because I'm so terribly family oriented, my mind goes back to two members of my family, one I never understood and always viewed him with a little fear, my father. And another person that I did understand and love so much, had no fear of her, even to the point that every time they wanted to punish me, she would demand to take over the task. She was my great-grandmother, 108, and couldn't hit very hard, was kind of hugging all the hitting, and kind of a saint in my life. I think of my own beginnings and what my father wished for me in education. There was a middle-class man, Watson, who ran a grocery store and gave blacks credit. He always cheated them, of course, because he kept the books. At the end of the week, they carried their paycheck so he could take out his share. My father always wished that, inasmuch as I had rejected the idea of being a farmer, one day I would be a grocery store owner. That didn't work. When I told him I wanted to be a writer, he said, I don't understand what a writer is or what writers do. But in that last time, saying farewell to me before I took free transportation to come to New York in a moving freight train that had an empty car, he said, if you must write, tell them how we live down here. And then as a second thought, he said, tell them how we suffer. In talking about education, I think of my own education, because so much of my education is around certain members of my family. My mother, another deity, who quietly made me her favorite and didn't tell me about it, never would own it up to it. And after she passed, my sisters and brothers tortured the hell out of me because they knew it all along. And my grandfather, my father made $18, the largest sum of money he ever made in his life in 1 week. And being his oldest son, I counted it over and over again, and he lectured on perseverance. If you work hard in this country, see what you can do. If you obey the law, believe, and assert yourself, see what you can do. $18 in 1 week. Years ago in the Army, years afterward in the Army, I took a shiner to some fancy Texas lady. Said she had a birthday, but I didn't know she had birthdays every time she met a new soldier. So I gave her a birthday party, tipped the maitre d', $57, all of which I got cutting the crap game. And I thought, what is education? What is reality? And what is fantasy? Then my mind went back to my grandmother again, telling me the Bible was the pure word of God, not to be disputed. When I asked questions about all those white angels, I said, shut up, boy. When I asked her why I was lost, the world was so different from other people. God in his own good time is going to explain that, boy. In the meantime, you shut up. You can't question God's words. That gave me a dilemma. And part of my education is my ability to ask questions. Why this? To disbelieve and say, does it make sense? And I learned a lot that way, lost some friends too. Now, to the subject, education and miseducation. We're at a dilemma in our existence as a people, and we have missed one of the golden opportunities in our existence, in the existence of a people, because we did not put in place at the right time the right people with the right information. After the Montgomery bus boycott, the beginning of the civil rights movement, after 1957, the independence of Ghana that set the African independence explosion in motion, after the conferences around the Caribbean Federation, after the re-emergence of the word Pan-African and a concept of an African world community, our enemies had the illusion that we were united, and they were ready to make concessions to us. And when they discovered that a lot of us were jiving, we didn't have it together, it began to set in motion an international apparatus to harness the potential power of the African world. So systematically, they frustrated African states, first by making them non-African states. They frustrated the Caribbean Federation with the nonsense that if you federate one island, especially Jamaica, might have to pay more taxes than the smaller islands. And Jamaica felt that these other islands would be a burden to her. So the concept of federation got away. Had there been federation at this time, there could have been a Caribbean Air Force, a Caribbean Army, a Caribbean Economic Union. There'd have been no Grenada. There'd have been no Panama. There'd have been no downgrading of the currency of Caribbean nation to the point where you can take 10 American dollars and almost buy a human being on almost any Caribbean island. And in the United States, where we had the largest amount of independent institutions of any people living outside of Africa, because we had taken advantage of a disadvantage. Jim Crow built institutions in our own community, small hotels, small but clean, nearly always run by a sister who could lay a decent plate before you that make other people apologize for cooking because she did it so well. Bands coming through town, black bands who couldn't stay in white hotels, generally stayed there in black rooming houses. We made a whole kind of industry, a business out of that disadvantage. Nearly every black community had a black tailor if you didn't want to be insulted by going into white stores, because if you tried on a suit, it's yours whether it fits you or not. We made a mistake and dismantled or neglected or let run down some institutions and some skills that we needed for nation building. This concept of miseducation really started after the Reconstruction, and it started in all places. It started in the Caribbean islands because they forgot that in the Caribbean islands they had the clearest revolutionary heritage of any people living outside of Africa. And not because they were braver than other African people, but because they had the one thing other African people did not have: a cultural continuity. They wasn't broken up so often. And so the concept of the family could remain at least partially together, because slave masters in the Caribbean bought in large lots and kept the lots together. This concept of kinship made revolution possible. So they had something going for them until they began to do what Blyden reminded us of in his inaugural address, Edmund Blyden, at Liberia College, 1881. We strive to be those things most unlike ourselves, and we feed grist into other people's mills. All of us in Africa, in the Caribbean islands, and in the United States, after Reconstruction and after emancipation in the Caribbean islands, and after independence, alleged independence, because it was never true in any place, began to strive for those things most unlike ourselves and most alien to the culture that had produced us, and began to neglect those things that gave us strength and durability to endure the most odious, the most hideous, the most vicious holocaust ever fastened upon a people in all human history. We forget today that no one has a monopoly on the word Holocaust, and that internal family dispute in Europe between Europeans and Europeans can in no way compare with what has happened to us as a people. We forgot the one thing that the late 19th century African in Africa and in the Caribbean islands and in the United States had pulled together. They could see in our first novelist, William Wells Brown, this longing for Africa again, and our father of nationalism, Martin Delany, And in his association with the Jamaican nationalist Campbell, in Prince Hall, they could see a striving of a people to put themselves together and be whole again. In that first half of that 19th century, that would produce a Delaney, a Douglas, a Prince Hall, a John B. Russwurm, that will see a combination of Caribbean and African Americans coming together, that will produce dynamic preachers whose dynamism in the face of struggle would make Martin Luther King stand back with admiration for their nerve. And I have a great admiration for Martin Luther King. These different men at a different time, Henry Highland Garnett, who said, "My motto is resistance, resistance." We have forgotten in the 20th century the great charge of the first half of that 19th century, that self-education that came out of the establishment in the United States of the Masonic order that he called, Prince Hall called the African Lodge, the establishment of the independent church, the establishment of a community base in New England. We've forgotten the most responsible group of Africans and African Americans, African Caribbeans, to come together. We've forgotten the birth of the Negro Convention movement in the first half of the 19th century. We've forgotten the debate around whether Liberia needed to be established, and when it was finally established, we've forgotten how wrongly we did this establishment, because we really didn't establish it. We got so taken with the religion of our oppressor, we began to sell it to other people. And so we went to Africa, allegedly to civilize our heathen brothers, not knowing that in Liberia you had the exiles from the last of the great independent states in Africa, Sangay, and not only independent, that lived 150 years into the slave trade period, a state that had a great university at Timbuktu and a university city at Dijen or Geni. All of this is forgotten now, and we think that we must build anew something which we already had, and we went to Africa with the wrong attitude toward the Africans and the wrong attitude toward a religion that we had picked up secondhand, and we were selling it to the Africans secondhand without letting the African know that the oppressor and the enslaver had the same religion and enslaved you in the name of the same religion. So therefore your approach to it cannot be the same. You can take it, but you must make of it an instrument of your liberation. Now that first half of that 19th century in Africa, the Africans discovered that slavery was turning into a more sophisticated form of slavery called colonialism. They did not go to London and for the chandeliers and perfumed ladies. They did not admire the drinks of London. They went to the field with their shields and their spears, and for 100 years they out-battled and out-strategized the leading military minds of Europe. So at the end of the second half of that 19th century, they began to ask for the return of their sovereignty, the return of the state. And our greatest crisis right now in both education and miseducation is that we have called for too many things too many times without calling for the kind of education that prepares us to control a state, every part of it, all of it. When people take away from you the concept of sovereignty, the mentality of sovereignty, and when you are programmed into dependency, you take an education from them that is second-hand, and you pass down an education that is second-hand. So you got a second-hand education, and you have a second-hand approach to how you rule yourself. And then again, like Blyden, you strive to be those things most unlike yourself. And you feed grist into other people's mills. And as Blyden said, nothing comes out except what has been put in. Now, when we came to the end of this century, we came to the end of the century in this country, white America had grown tired of communicating with a multiplicity of leaders. So they chose one that they wanted to communicate with. They anointed him, and white editorial writers presented him to us. Very few people have been thorough and honest in the way they look at him. I taught a class on the 19th century struggle at Cornell, then at Hunter. I said, I'm going to deal with Booker T. Washington in 3 sessions. I take pride in being kind to students and being very considerate of the feelings of students, even when I disagree. I said, but the first student that called Booker T. Washington Uncle Tom hit the door. He was a strategist whose strategy didn't always work. He laughed when something wasn't funny, and he said yes when he didn't mean it, so another generation can say, hell no. Very few people look at him as a sacrificial man, making way for another generation to move education higher than where he left it. Young men walked to Tuskegee across 3 states, no money. He began not only to have shoe repair courses and shoe repair shops, but to design shoes. And for years, blacks who made a living in developing orthopedic shoes were trained at Tuskegee. The best cooks and bakers were trained at Tuskegee. Tuskegee's cooks and bakers schools were so good that the Army sent its cooks and bakers to Tuskegee for training. Now, when we were into training of this nature, when they had plumbing courses at Tuskegee, the early black printers were trained at Tuskegee. Now, what I'm talking about now, I'm talking about education and miseducation. When we lost that Tuskegee spirit of training, of practical training, when we lost the idea of getting across to our young people that a man who can lay a towel in a bathroom correctly makes the same kind of money as a college professor and sometimes more. So be a college professor if you want to, but you don't have to. A good plumber makes more than a college president and don't work all the year. Now, when we were getting across these nation-building skills, and had we hung into this kind of education, it did not rule out liberal education. Those who wanted to learn to play the piano can still learn to play the piano. Because this education would have prepared us to take over our communities, and our communities were miniature nations. And what we had been trained out of is the attitude of ruling a nation. And what the Booker T. Washington concept was bringing us back to, the training and the preparation for us to control a community, for us to be self-reliant. If you live in a brick house, why not own a brick yard? It makes sense. Now, when you can look at all of this and look at almost 2 generations of basic, skillfully trained blacks, you can see what we lost by thinking that the Tuskegee approach to education had to be replaced by liberal arts, and most of the time it was trained by liberal arts. I'm not ruling out liberal arts. Now, because I don't have those kind of skills, doesn't mean that I don't admire those kind of skills. I was trained in the Army, and why they thought that my test proved that I would be a mechanic, I will never know. Because I've got a good memory. Among 250 men, I made the 3rd highest mark. When they gave me the instrument, told me to time a motor, I couldn't do it. Because all I knew was theory. And when I was in the hills of Texas teaching men combat driving, I got lost. I knew all the theory. But for the practicality, I couldn't bring it off. And I can remember the occasion, might be a digression, but we had a man in the company called Spears, and we measured stupidity by Spears. Oh man, even Spears knows that. If Spears knows it, everybody knows it. You know, because he was, man, couldn't write, couldn't. But he was so skillful. He could fix any motor with his eyes closed. He'd tell you to race a motor, he could walk away from it and listen. And when he turned back, almost like a doctor diagnosing an illness, he would identify what's exactly wrong, and he would be right every single time. Here's a man illiterate. He didn't drive trucks. He put them on and wore them. So I'm way up in the hills of Texas. I got 18 inches. And if that convoy of 27 trucks now, I'm in the head, I'm the truck master, big shot. If they buy 18 inches, I'm in a gully. About $200,000 for the government equipment gone, plus the back a whole lot of men's lives lost. I got up there and panicked. I stopped and said, tell Spears to come up here. Take over. So I said, lead this convoy home. And he did. Paced them properly, parked them 6 feet apart, government regulation. I said, well, Spears, the government said you can't promote a man who's can't read. I said, I'm going to find a way to promote you. And then I took two of the smart alecks in the company who was getting on my damn nerves. I hereby order you to teach Spears to read and write. And I will give you 6 weeks to do it. 6 weeks, Spears brought in a letter he had written to his family and read it to me.
Thank you.
I said, well, Corporal Spears. He went overseas as a truck master. I was a trained truck master and couldn't bring it off. He was just a truck driver and he could bring it off. What's the difference between the educational one? I was educated with theory, read more books than most men see in a lifetime because I've always been searching for information. But I'm saying that while we miss a lot of things that we need in our communities, those great naturals who didn't go to school,
Yes.
who didn't get all the way through, but who had some good personal skills. There was a time we could use them in our community. We didn't ask about degrees. Can you fix the pipe? Can you stop the leak?
That's right.
Not whether you went. Ooh. Can you plaster? Can you do this? We forgot a holistic look at education. And we began to do this after the turn of the century, when working with your hands wasn't fashionable, and we had worked on the land, and the land became distasteful to us, and we retreated to the city while we worked in factories and brickyards and had to go to grocery stores and get food on credit. We left the land where we could get food from the farm. We ate better because we were eating straight from the earth. We didn't eat anything out of a can. It was unthinkable to eat anything out of a can. This is a practical kind of self-sustaining education that we gave up in our retreat to the city, that we gave up the land physically. Thousands of acres of the land. And when you give up land, you give up the basis of nation. For land is the basis of nation. And if you listen to Malcolm X's message to the grassroots, you get the point. What he's trying to get across to you is that no nation no land. Someone asked me recently to name the one African head of state that might have the possibility of the unification of Africa. I said I would name Mugabe, except that when he came to power and left the land in the hands of the whites. He didn't restore the land to the people. Iron Smith had more land than the state of Delaware. It's his personal property, when he should have been hung the first day of independence. What I'm trying to say is that there were certain moments in our history when we should have sat down and rethought education in its entirety. We should have done what the Japanese did after Perry and Admiral Perry kicked open the door and told them, trade with the West whether you like it or not. And they were not military in a position not to obey, and they accepted their humiliation. But from among them came a great nationalist and leader, forgotten by history now, Baron Takamura. He gathered the young people in Japan around him, mostly men at this time. He said, go to the West, get that education, and come back. Make this a modern nation, but don't make it less a Japanese nation. We could not combine the two things. And that is what went wrong in Ghana. The lack of combining a traditional state with the modern state. It was possible. One did not have to rule out the other, but you could have effected a wedding between the two. But Takamura lined up these competent Japanese young people, and he didn't say, please study oceanography, because a sovereign nation has to know oceanography. Please study harbor management, because a modern nation have to have a good harbor management. He said, oceanography for you, medicine for you, science for you, and you better not come back as a failure. And a lot of Japanese who failed didn't even go home. Wouldn't dare go home. Now, this sounds dictatorial, but sometimes good things have to be dictated or they don't exist at all. I'm for stopping saying, please, if we're going to exist as a people, we better take our young people aside and tell them these are certain things that goes into the making of a nation that you have to learn if we're going to survive. And if you don't learn them, we won't survive. Because if you don't take care of business, business is going to be taken care of. Somebody else will take care of it. They'll re-enslave you based on the fact that you didn't take care of business. You get your flag independence, and yet you ask, who made the safety pin to hold your child's diaper together? Your local industry is not even producing a handkerchief. Now, near the end of the 19th century, this striving to come together was ragged and yet beautifully sincere. At the end of that century, a Trinidadian lawyer put a name on it: Pan-Africanism. He called a conference in London. This was the time we needed to begin to look at the possibilities of ruling a state again And the first call of that conference was not for independence, but for the kind of education that will prepare Africans for eventual independence. A very moderate thing to ask for. Du Bois was there, and we have forgotten his tremendous contribution to the concept of Pan-Africanism. We've forgotten that the Pan-African concept was almost solely, in its initial stage, a Caribbean contribution. We've forgotten the Caribbean contribution of Pan-Africanism was born in the Caribbean, and yet it never grew in the Caribbean. Didn't grow then, won't grow now. Because the mentality is British, Spanish, Dutch. The mentality is whoever ruled them. Because they never looked toward Africa as home. Home became the headquarters of the colonial master and former slave master. Douglass said in his older age that the Republican Party is the ship. All else is the open sea. Take into consideration, Douglass is getting a little old, a little touched in the head. And take into consideration that the Republican Party has never been our ship. But I look at the state as the mother ship, the ultimate, the container for the soul and the aspirations of a people. And that no people truly free until they regain that container, that incubator that I classify as the state. And that as long as a people are outside of the state or the mother ship, they are politically and culturally motherless children. And we have to look on that vast number of Africans in Africa miseducated as motherless children. Because they come back to Africa, they are uneasy in Africa. And those who come back, educated abroad, come back to the Caribbean, they are uneasy. And those in the United States are uneasy because you are uneasy with the bulk of the people who labor, who make the bread, who till the farm, who bring in the milk, who do the basic labor. If they stopped, they could stop a nation. See, little people do not know how big they are. But if you think of all the things they do that contains a nation, and if they stop doing these things, what would happen? Then the Booker T. Washington concept is not to stop them from doing it, but to make them do it so well they can command a good salary for having done so. Because they become the foundation, the basis of the functioning of a nation. He did not rule out the elite, but he looked for a responsible elite. And Du Bois's disappointment in the talented 10 that he would live to see is that the talented 10, in addition to being lacking in talent, they were lacking in commitment.
Yes, right.
And that to build a nation, a people must be educated toward responsibility. Now, we toyed with this idea of Pan-Africanism. It became a talking piece. And yet Pan-Africanism was a child away from home without a mother. March 7th, 1958, when Nkrumah said to the populace on the midnight of independence, "At last the long night is over. Our beloved nation, Ghana, is free forever." Pan-Africanism, the motherless child, had found a home. Now the concept had geography. None of us saw that then. And we have to understand that a people and that a doctrine that holds a people together, the big umbrella of their authority, their world authority, must be operational in many places. It must have different definitions, and yet it must have the same definitions. And it must run across religious lines, political lines, and social lines. And you don't stop being an African person and part of the totality of the African struggle by being an AKA or a Delta. You don't become less a part of that struggle. But you should be a more intelligent part of that struggle and a more useful part of that struggle by virtue of having been exposed to a college education. But if you use a college education to look down on the struggle, you are an enemy of the struggle. Yeah, just a little bit. What I'm trying to say is that we have taken a poor count of ourselves in the world. That the argument around the Caribbean Federation missed the point, and the argument around African independence missed the point because they thought that loyalty began and ended at their respective borders, and all of those borders were artificial, drawn by foreigners, aliens, fakers, fools, missionaries. And that Africa never created the nation state. The Africans wear their states like they wear their clothes, loose, so that the wind can circulate through them. So they had a combination of states within a territory. He created the territorial state as against the tight-bordered nation state. Many times these states are not viable because the resources are cut in half. Sometimes the cultures are cut in half. So the African has to get back to that kind of state that is livable within his own political and cultural framework. And in the Caribbean islands, everybody has to take their nose out of the air and realize that the slave ships brought no Jamaicans, no Trinidadians, but all African people. And some put down on an island called Jamaica, they became Jamaicans. Island called Trinidad, they became Trinidadians. One called St. Lucia, they became St. Lucians. But they were all African people. And that the rehearsal for slavery took place in the Caribbean islands. The rehearsal for the slavery in the United States. And that the African in the United States suffered more and longer because Europe dumped its human garbage can in the so-called New World. And the worst of that garbage can was dumped into the United States. Africans and Caribbeans should have some kind of understanding for what we have had to endure in the United States, and we should all reach out to each other with that understanding in our education, which must be education to rule a state. If it's education to rule a state, it has to be education to come together as one people.
Yeah.
Now, I am a dreamer, and I'm always making things inside of my mind and seeing if I can make them practical. Where I conceived it, I believe that the African away from home has the key to the future of Africa. Africa has the lock. That key and that lock is going to have to come together. That in learning how to survive and learning how to fight the wars of our oppressor, and learning how to run the mills of our oppressor, and learn how to make the shoes for our oppressor, we've learned how to industrialize Africa. We should be the ones to industrialize Africa and not to go with our nose in the air like those fools who found Liberia going to civilize their heathen brothers. We're going to form a partnership and to put together the Africans in Africa, the Africans in the United States, the Africans in the Caribbean islands, those in the Pacific islands, those in India. You got 1 billion people on the face of the earth. And we're going to make an alliance with ourselves. And the first people we need is ourselves, first and foremost. We will not think about what kind of terms we're going to get with other people. We will be so strong. We will think about what kind of terms we're going to give other people if we need them at all. Africa is the richest depository. Untapped oil, untapped mineral resources, untapped and unused geography, hydroelectric potential in all the world. Africa not only industrialized Africa, Africa could feed all Africa and a great deal of the world from 6 of its riverbanks. I've gone down the Congo River. It's 1 mile wide in some places and almost 1/2 mile deep. With good engineering, all Africa can be irrigated by water in Africa that's flowing out of Africa to the sea. The sea don't need the water, and the sea wouldn't miss the water. With good engineering, you can stop the Sahara from moving to the south. You can find the waterbed in the Sahara activated and moisten that vast desert. It might eventually build cities again. We have to come out of this selfishness. We have to learn how to build a different equipment. We are very imaginative. We have to learn how to use our energy in a different way. We spend enough energy on a dance floor to build 10 cities.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not saying don't dance, but I'm saying direct our energy toward a concept of nation building. Pull our young people toward us and closer to us. Talk to them more. Talk to them earlier. They want our love. They want our instructions.
Yes, they do.
They want our direction. And sometimes they are striking out because no one has told them how to use that vast, young, creative energy. It is our job to teach them how to convert that energy into nations. and to show them that people who are ruling nations, who are not as wise as they are, people who are ruling nations are inept, and they're doing a pretty bad job of it. They're going to have to get up enough nerve to say and to look at the inadequacy of people ruling over them and say, I can do a better job than that. And go ahead and do it. And in spite of the difference between us and denominations, which I think is a terrible waste of time, but I don't want to get into the religious thing because I'm so spiritual, I really think religion is a waste of time. Because I think spirituality is man's highest calling. It is spirituality that lifts man higher than the dog. Religions are Protestant and very prejudiced one to the other, and then turning to their God to justify their murder. They've made God ungodly. Before all of this happened, the African created a way of life that had no jail because no one had ever gone to one. They had no word for it. No word for divorce because no one had ever gotten one. I'm not saying we can reconstruct all of these things, but part of our education for tomorrow might be that vast school outside of the physical school, the home, the community, when we become part of each other again, when we can see an adult on the street and we just straighten up because it's an adult.
Right.
I grew up in that kind of environment. And when I see the teacher coming, we was all our little dirty work. We clean up ourselves, brush up, get that little tired look out on our face, you know. About it, teacher.
I've been here for as long as I remember, running through the plains of civilized Ethiopia. Way back then we used to call it Abyssinia, played by the Nile River, me and my brothers. I came via vessel called my mother. We spoke mentally, then she conceived me immaculately. My father is Osiris and we took trips to Sirius. Stopped on Mars where we built a few pyramids. Came back home, I knew it wouldn't be long before the invasion began, so we wrote it in stone. Me and Mello took a quick trip to Asia, scoped the place out before they called it minor major. Built a few temples to praise we, the Buddha. The people called us Nagas, symbolic of the dragon. I've been to places you can't even imagine. Put the Jupe in Jupiter, put the rings around Saturn. Carved out the rocks for that Stonehenge pattern. We played with the stars before we started playing Madden. Do you remember? Can you recall? Cause if you think you were a slave, you can't remember at all. I said, Joe, do you remember? Can you recall? Cause if you think you were a slave, you can't remember at all. Yo, it's all for the love, so I love what I does. ALD, think of me till your heart is a buzz.